Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 246. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Joan Fernandez about her new novel, Saving Vincent. This work of historical fiction is the story of Jo Van Gogh, sister-in-law of painter Vincent Van Gogh and wife of Vincent's brother Theo. After the death of her husband, who died only 6 months after his brother, Jo inherited Vincent's artwork. At the time, the paintings were worthless, but Jo worked tirelessly to persuade people to take Vincent's art seriously. And she succeeded. People began to appreciate his art and buy his paintings. Thus, it was Jo who promoted the work, developed a market for the paintings, and rescued Vincent Van Gogh from obscurity. In this episode, I'll chat with Joan about her writing journey, how much of her research involved reading letters written by Jo, Theo, and Vincent, and why she finds similarities between Jo Van Gogh and actress and comedian Lucille Ball, as well as a few other things coming up. Joan Fernandez, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here, Stacey. Thank you so much.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, Saving Vincent. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
I would love to share about this book. It's Saving Vincent, a novel of Jo Van Gogh, and she is the central character. She is a real person, or was a real person. Jo Van Gogh was the sister-in-law of the famous painter Vincent, and that means she was married to Vincent's brother, Theo. And I'm telling the little-known story of how it was Jo who inherited Vincent's work after her husband died, and she is the one that marketed and persuaded people over time to buy Vincent's work. I like to say that she saved his artwork from obscurity, because when Vincent died, he had his brother actually had sold only one painting. And so Jo's story of really rescuing all the 900 paintings and 1,100 drawings from really the trash heap is the story that I tell in my book. And this is from the early 1900s. I love to tell the story of how I came about her. I was at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam with some girlfriends. And you know how in art museums you can take these audio tours where you wear the headphones, or you could use your iPhone for this curated voice. Well, I decided to do that when I was in the museum. And so as a result, I spent an hour of just listening to Vincent's story, going from painting to painting, and you just get overwhelmed with this sense of this individual that was such an underdog, and yet he stayed so dedicated to his sense of kind of his unique artistic vision. So I'm at the end of this tour. It's I've been at it for an hour, and I'm just sort of full of this emotion. And I think if your listeners, some of them may have gone to some of these immersion programs for Van Gogh, you kind of get just this sense of emotional response to him. Well, I'm in this state. And at the end of the exhibit, I spy this family chart of Vincent's family. And so I go over there, And there's these little black and white kind of postage stamp photos of people. And so I see his father, who was this minister, totally misunderstood Vincent, thought, he was a total failure. There's his mother. She wasn't much better. She loved her son, but they really felt like he wasn't getting his act together. And then I see a photo of Theo, and Theo was an art dealer. And many people know through the letters that Vincent and Theo wrote that he was like a he was like an emotional lifeline for Vincent and financial. He supported him all 10 years of Vincent's artistic life. And so I'm looking at Theo thinking, oh man, you were amazing. But then I notice that Theo died just 6 months after Vincent. And this really struck me because I had thought that Theo had gone on to spend a lifetime of promoting his brother's works, but he hadn't. And so next to Theo, married to him, is this little black and white photo of a young woman. And the caption said, Joanna Van Gogh Bonger, with a notation that she was the one that inherited his works. And then she took it upon herself to promote and ultimately, over time, develop a market and then a name for Vincent that today is crazy because it's known, his name is known around the world, and millions of people come to his art exhibitions. So she essentially took this treasure trove of work that was worthless and today is priceless. So when I'm standing in that museum, I'm thinking, why don't I know about her? And that, Stacy, was kind of the fish hook that nestled into my thought. I was working full time at then. I wasn't at all thinking about writing a book, but her story really stuck with me.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Jo, because I'm curious what she was like as a person, what you were able to learn, what your impressions were about this young woman, because you mentioned she had sort of this monumental task ahead of her. And we'll talk about the path of resistance that was ahead of her when she was trying to do this. But what was she like as a person? What were you able to discover about her?
Well, I really had a lot of fun trying to figure out who she was. There are some diaries that she wrote as a young woman, but I found a real wonderful stash of letters that Jo wrote to Theo when they were engaged. So it's 100 letters. I read them all. And I would say that that was my first entry point in really getting to understand who she was. And the reason is when people write letters, it's as close to your own thinking as you can imagine. So in this correspondence, Jo was sharing with Theo, and Theo was sharing with her what their hopes and expectations were for a marriage together. And it starts out kind of like, I like this kind of wallpaper, and hey, I bought this new dress. But then it becomes really more personal and vulnerable. And Theo says things like, I long to have a partner that will share the burdens of what I'm trying to achieve here in Paris, which was super high stress, like a dogfight out there for art dealing at the time, right? And Jo is asking him questions like, how do you know that art is good? How do you look at art? How do you view your brother's art? Things like that. So there is this beautiful sort of connection that's starting to happen when Theo responds to her. It's almost like he's sharing with her how to evaluate and look at art. He says things like, you have to look beyond the paint. He says you have to have an emotional response. And especially for Vincent's work, he said, you have to throw away all your conventional ideas when you first look at his paintings. So as he's writing those things, I'm thinking and seeing Jo's responses, I can see a real openness on her part to learn. But not only that, but she had kind of a sensitivity to understanding the abstract as he was talking about it. So the reason I'm bringing this up, because that kind of exposure to that correspondence led me into really looking much more deeply into her childhood. And here's what I found. She grew up in a typical household in that her dad was an industrialist. He was totally being able to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution. He was involved in shipping as an editor of this daily bulletin, and that meant they were a part of the rising middle class. So, what did that mean? It meant that Jo grew up thinking, oh, okay, so a woman's place is really involved in the private sphere of the home. Because for her father, a sign of success for him was that women were taken care of in the home, right? So Jo's thinking that as she grows up. One item of luxury that her father allowed the family is he loved music. So Jo grew up playing the piano. All of her brothers and sisters, there were seven of them. They all played different instruments, and every Sunday they do their own little concerts in their salon. Their father, this is Hendrik is his name, took them out to the opera, to concerts, to all sorts of things throughout her childhood. And then when Jo went to school, she ended up taking classes in music, so much so that one biographer said that she had the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in music. And so knowing that she had that sensitivity of creating emotion from music, it wasn't that big of a step for her to think about art eliciting an emotional response. And I think that that was a big step forward in terms of her being able to be a real collaborator in understanding what Theo was saying to her. So this background to me was really helped answer a question that I kept asking myself over and over. And that was, later on, how could Jo have the conviction that Vincent's work was valuable when the status quo at the time said, no, it was ugly, it's rebellious, it's quote unquote wrong. And so those are a couple of the seeds, or I should say the threads that I really pulled on to sort of make sure that that made sense, that she wasn't her dedication to Vincent and an appreciation for his artwork wasn't just sort of this magical thing that happened, but she had really an entire childhood and teenage years of being immersed in music. And I really think that helped.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about timeline.
Okay.
Because it's not as if Jo and Theo enjoyed 50 long years of marriage and she was in a part of that family for decades. Let's talk about the timeline. And they were formative years when she was being courted by Theo. They were married. Vincent became a part of their lives, their married life, and then their death. So how much time are we talking here?
Well, I begin the book. This is not a spoiler because it's in the first chapter. I begin it when Theo dies. And so prior to that, Jo and Theo had been married less than 2 years. And prior to that, they'd only known each other about a year. And so, and in fact, there's this great story of when Theo was totally besotted by Jo because she's the sister of his best friend. He's Dutch, but he's working in Paris. They go home for the holidays. They're best friends. They visit each other's homes. Theo meets Jo, and he's just love at first sight. And so they'd only met a couple of times. When he can't help himself, he asks her to marry him, and she's like, no, like I don't even know you, But I mean, it was smart on his part because, of course, then she couldn't get him out of her mind. She couldn't get it out of her thought. And so I'm not sure who made the move. That spontaneous proposal happened in the spring. By the fall, by December of that year, and I believe that was 1889, they were engaged. So he must have been working on her subconsciously or something. But what happened then was just this beautiful, beautiful thing, because Theo was just under enormous stress. And we can talk about that a little bit, but I really believe that he and Jo she was almost an unofficial apprenticeship with him, and that she shared so much in his work, and that he trusted her thoughts. He trusted her opinions. And so she has this experience moving from growing up saying women have this sort of exalted on this pedestal situation with her father, now she's being asked what she thinks, and she's giving thoughts, and she's learning. And the reason I know this is because there was a couple of times when she had to make a decision about which drawings of Vincent to offer to an exhibit when Theo was unavailable, and she did it. So she was drawing from, I'm thinking, conversations and so forth. So she has this experience of being valued, being considered an equal. And it's also reflected in those letters that they had. So when he dies, after less than 2 years of marriage, and they did have a baby. She had a baby. The baby was 1 year old when Theo died. It was truly a heartbreak, I imagined, because he opened a window, giving her a sense of freedom and worth that now was shutting because he was no longer
Right,
there.
right. And Vincent, throughout their marriage, was kind of an integral part of that marriage in a way. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the role he played in that family?
Absolutely. Yes, he and Theo were just super close. And it's that type of closeness where you rub on each other and just it's just too much, and you have to like separate from each other. But then you sort of think fondly about the other person, and then so when so I think Joe only met Vincent 3 times in real life, but right from the beginning in those letters, she's asking about Vincent, and Theo is responding. And so I believe that she really knew she was marrying and took upon herself appreciating just the dedication and the devotion that Theo had towards his older brother. At the time that they married, Vincent was in the south of France and in Saint Remy, the asylum. He was there for a year. Oh, or actually, when they married was right before that, when there's the famous incident when Vincent cuts off part of his ear, and then that then leads to him ultimately staying in an asylum. So he was in the background. And on the one hand, there's letters from Vincent to Theo that says, I'm so happy for you. And on the other hand, I think he was really frightened that Theo would stop supporting him financially just because of the stresses of now having his own family. And the reason that I say that is one of the times when Theo and Joe and the baby visit Vincent. This is now after he's come back north from the south of France. They get into kind of a fight after Joe kind of asks innocently, so when are you going to start selling your work? I mean, he doesn't say it like that, but and he flips out. So Vincent is initially in the background, then he comes up north, visits them in Paris. He sees their son, whom they named after him. So their son's name was Vincent. And then Vincent goes on to Auvers-sur-Oise, which is kind of northwest of Paris. And that was where he spent, his last months of life and ultimately committed suicide. So he's present in the marriage. His actual appearance in the flesh was only like 3 times, but I would say, it was probably a part of their daily
Right.
conversation. And his artwork was everywhere. I mean, all over the apartment, in rolls under the bed with the dust bunnies. I mean, it's like their apartment is stuffed, like 400 paintings and crates, and like, so it's a good thing that she really,
She liked
really
the
liked
work.
them.
Well, let's talk about that because, as you mentioned, she was the one who championed his work and him as an artist after he passed and after her husband, Theo, passed. As you mentioned, there was a great deal of pushback from the art world. So I imagine people probably thought, here's this young woman who is banging this drum that no, these paintings are good, and not just good but great, and he is worthy of note as an artist. And they probably thought, one, she's crazy or desperate or just wrong, has no sense of taste in art, whatever, because the whole rest of the world has dismissed him and his work. What does that speak to, do you think? That she just continued to press forward? Was it sheer just appreciation for the work? Was it loyalty to these brothers? Or what do you think kept her going?
I believe that that's a great question because I ask myself that a ton myself. I believe that she's a single parent. This is her only son, and it's the only child that she will have with Theo, who was the love of her life. So I imagined that she would want to keep Theo alive or bring him to life for her son. Who this is your father. This is who, who he was and what he was dedicated to. And that included then making sure that the inheritance that she shared with Vincent. So at the time, the law was such that when Theo died, his estate passed to Jo, which she shared at 50% with their infant son. And he would not be able to, you know, take charge of that inheritance until he was the age of 25. And so I believe that part of her motivation was wanting to realize value out of the inheritance that his father had left for him. And that in a way it was honoring Theo. In the book, I share how I believe over time that admiration then became a part of a desire to also see Vincent honored. But I felt like it would be a real emotional response to truly want to honor a husband that she was grieving.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point because she was a young woman when,
She was
right?
27.
And so, and that's a big undertaking to
Mm.
to push against the tide like that when everybody
Mm-hmm.
is telling you no and you keep having
Mm-hmm.
to say yes. You need to believe
Mm-hmm.
me. Let's talk about getting that story, her story, down on paper. So, because it's a you've written a work of historical fiction. It's a novel. How did you decide? I want to write a novel, so I want to base this. I want it to be a fictionalized version of her story. So, what went into that decision making process? And then I'm curious when you decided, okay, I will start here. This is the part of the story that I want to tell. I wanted a kind of insight into the decision making process for how you were going to get this woman's story down on paper.
Okay. Well, I have to tell you, I was kind of making it up as I went along, but
That's the best part.
the 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 first answer to your question, which is how this story came about, I have to say that I was full throttle in my career. I was, high pressure, high intensity, no time to think of anything else. And I have I'd been to the Van Gogh Museum, and sort of tucked that experience away. But it was maybe 8 months later, I'm at lunch with girlfriends, and we start goofing around. We start saying, it's like 20 minutes before one. We all have to be back at the office at one. So we got a little bit of time after we finished our sandwiches. And so we're saying, hey, what would you put on your tombstone? So we're saying things like, no more PowerPoints, stuff like that. And then we go around with our, here lies, we're talking about ourselves. So I go, here lies Joan. She always said she'd write a book and she never did. And like everybody laughs. But Stacy, I felt like I got kicked in the gut,
Um,
like right then. And I thought, oh my God, what if I don't write a book? And the thing is when I was in college, I used to tell these people I was going to be an author. And then when I got my first job, I'm like, oh yeah, but I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book. But life takes over with rent and family and mortgage and so I remember at that lunch, after that lunch, I'm thinking, well, it's not going to write itself. Like, so what I did then was, okay, so I'm full throttle, remember, into my career. And I was a senior executive. I was in marketing for a financial services firm. So, a lot of meetings, a lot of stuff going on. But I thought, okay, if I'm going to try writing, I just need to put my toe in the water. So that after work that day, I drove to Barnes and Noble and I bought all the writing magazines I saw. Writer's Digest, Poets and Lovers, no, Poets and Lovers, Poets and what is that? Poets and Writers, and I subscribed because I thought if it comes in the mail, that's like, and so my curiosity was, what would it take to be an author? I took some vacation days and I went on this writer's retreat, and I was like stunned by the creativity there, from people who were like 20 years younger than me. And I don't mean anything about age. I just mean, wow, I was really impressed. And so I thought, okay, this is going to take some work. And then I joined this virtual group with all these other artists and musicians and writers. And it was like, I used to feel like I was sitting on the top row of the bleachers, just listening, thinking like, this is a different world than the financial world.
Right.
This is like cool people, right? so, so I'm up there on the top of the bleachers, just listening, every now and then making a little comment. And then somebody, like maybe 3-4 weeks into this program, a writer asks me, Joan, what kind of a book are you thinking of writing? And in popped Jo Van Gogh into my thought. And so I said, a story like that. And she said, or you could write that story. And I thought, no, 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 no. There are PhDs that have written about Van Gogh. I can't do that. But then I started to think, well, Jo wasn't a PhD. Like, I'm telling her story. I'm not writing about Van Gogh's works.
Right.
So with that as kind of what I'd latched onto, I then started to take classes and start to practice some of these ideas about what's your goal, what's your, what might be a character arc. I mean, all sorts of storytelling skills that I didn't have because I was very competent in corporate speak. I was not competent in storytelling. And so that was the beginning. And then ultimately, I chose to retire because I was leaning in, and I felt like I had that tailwind behind me to keep me going. So fast forward now to your question about how do you decide what to write? Well, here's the horrible truth, and that is that I did do research on Jo. I have to tell you, because of this sense of, wow, if I don't write this book, it's never gonna happen. It's not gonna write itself. I think that I jumped into the deep end, meaning I started to write. And so I imagined gaps in her story that I could not find through research. I reimagined pieces, and I was writing a fiction, so nothing wrong with that. But the challenge was that after I'd worked on this manuscript for 2 years, so I worked with editors, I was really learning how to write, a biography comes out on Jo. And here's what happened. All those gaps that I'd filled in, now there's factual information. And honestly, that first manuscript was ready. It was polished. It was ready, to be sent to agents or whatever. And I had to make the decision, do I start over? Because honestly, I felt I couldn't, I just made up too much that was completely not in her life. So at that point, and this was in 2020, I decided to put that first manuscript in a drawer and start all over. But my challenge was, so I knew this biography now filled in all the gaps that I had put in, but the challenge was the biography was in Dutch.
Oh.
It was produced by the Van Gogh Museum, so it's super credible.
Yes.
But so I contacted them whether they had an English version on the way, and they said, hey, because of the pandemic, all bets are off. Yeah, we're going to do it sometime, but we don't know. So I tried translating. This is a biography of her entire life. And I had already chosen, I would just do this initial 15 years period, which is in my book today. So I needed several chapters, but not the entire book. And I tried translating it with a translation app on my phone, which was a disaster. But then, so I'm thinking, it was so crazy. I bought the Dutch version. And so the answers are there in front of me, but unreachable. So a friend of a friend knew of a teacher in the Netherlands that was out of work because of the pandemic. And one thing led to another. I reached out to her on Facebook. She was willing to translate the pages that I needed. And of course, I was paying her to do that. And so every week she sent me 10 pages, it translated into English. And as she submitted those pages, I built out a spreadsheet because that I had a chronological record for Jo, because the biography is written sort of thematically. I now there is an English version now, and I have it, and I've read it, and it's wonderful, of course, but I needed I needed to be really, really solid on facts. So I created a spreadsheet as she submitted the pages, and that took us about 4 months. And then, Stacy, I had this spreadsheet with all the information that I was missing. But the problem was, this is a 50-page Excel document, and I am not an Excel person, but nevertheless, there it is. I realized I did not have a story. And here's why. Because in a chronology, it's this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Then, there's no climax, there's no point of no return, there's no, devastating situation, there's no. So what happened next is I was talking to a writer friend, and she shared with me there's a gentleman who teaches about writing scripts, Michael Hague, Hague, and he has a 3-act framework with then different points of those decisions: new opportunity, point of no return, um, you know, climax, and so forth. And so I thought, I'm going to take this framework and see if I can see it in the spreadsheet. And that's what I did. I was able to find those points that could then create the ups and downs and the tension that telling a story needs. And that meant that I left out some exhibitions that she did and so forth, but there's a lot in the book. So I highly recommend the English version of the Van Gogh Museum's biography if people want all of the, all the works that Jo did. Is really impressive. But that was my journey, and that took me a long time, Stacy.
No, I don't doubt that. Oh my gosh. Well, now that you have walked a mile or a marathon in Jo's shoes, I'm curious what lessons you learned. Not necessarily what you learned about her, but what lessons you learned, what you learned from her. And did you find that the experience of writing about her in particular changed you at all, or did you have your own takeaways from this?
I would say that writing her story was a means for me to find my own voice. And so, what I mean by that is what I came to appreciate, among the many things that I came to appreciate about Jo, is I truly felt like she had an intuitive sense of what today we would call marketing. She could connect dots that at the time were not normal for people to do when it came to selling art. They thought it was a certain way to do it. And I like to draw the analogy between Jo and her intuitive sense of marketing. So to me, that genius means it's really simple and clear to the person who has the insight, but to others, it doesn't feel that good. And so the person I love to compare Jo to is Lucille Ball, who had this unique sense of comedy. Studio executives were, totally against it. So she had to form her own company. And then for those people who have watched this old sitcom, I Love Lucy, it's still the best performing, most successful sitcom ever, because she had a sense of comic genius that she could then bring to the screen, and was, incredibly successful. So Lucille Ball had to just do her own thing in order to bring it to light, instead of trying to convince others. And so Jo, much the same way, she just had to do things. And so an example would be, and I like to call it a marketing genius. And because my background is marketing, I've counted 8 different strategies that she did. One of them is that at one point, Jo read all of Vincent's letters, and I did too. There's 900 letters that you can get from the Van Gogh Museum, and it took me months. But you really get this sense of who Vincent was, who is really, like we all are as humans, totally complex, you know, frustrating, funny, inspired, passionate, you know, all the above. So Jo reads all these letters, and then this opportunity comes along where a friend of Vincent's, Emile Bernard, who was an artist, says, "Hey, you know what? I want to submit an article about Vincent to the editor of a art magazine in Paris, Le Mercure." And so Jo says, "Okay, I tell you what, I'm going to translate excerpts from Vincent's letters into French and include some drawings and send those to be put in the magazine." And the editor agreed to one issue, but the issue that he submitted was so popular, he ended up doing another 5. So today, we would call that branding. We would say, oh, yeah, I want to know who that artist or that musician is in their private life, or that actor. And so she, by selecting the letters and the drawings that accompanied them, she humanized Vincent. She created a connection for the Paris public, at least of curiosity. And that was a way of beginning to establish a market. So I love that example because we're so familiar with it when it comes to celebrities. We like to, we're curious about what's on their Instagram, and oh, look, they're normal. They go to the grocery store, stuff like that. So so I wouldn't say that I'm an intuitive marketer, but I could recognize her strategies when I saw them.
Right. Ahead of her time.
Yeah.
Well, now that you've written this book and it's out there in the world, what do you have planned next? More books, hopefully? Are you working on anything currently?
Right now, I want to give Jo a good launch. I think that her story is must be known. I mean, why not? Her this piece of history should be known, because the person that she helped is so galactically known. And what's interesting to me is I was a Van Gogh fan before I started this work. And knowing the context of Jo's contribution to him, it actually deepened my appreciation for Vincent. Mm. So I'm going to be working on just feeling like I'm doing my part to share Jo's story so that it's more broadly known. And then I do have a couple of ideas of things that I'll work on. But remember how I said I like to jump in with both feet into the deep end before I'm ready? And so I want to give Jo a little bit of justice and work on promoting this, trying to get the word out on this book first.
Good. Well, you mentioned that you have now a new, deeper appreciation for Van Gogh's works. Do you have a favorite? And did you learn whether Jo had a particular favorite amongst his 400 something works that were crammed into her little apartment?
Well, I believe that her favorite was Almond Blossom, which is a picture. It's against a really bright blue sky, and it's all these tree branches with white and pink blossoms on it. Vincent painted that in response to the news that Theo and Jo had a new baby boy. So it's this lovely sort of picture of welcome, and it was almost like an olive branch, saying, look at this wonderful family, right? And so it was Jo's favorite. So Stacy, it's my favorite.
Nothing wrong with that. Okay. She had good taste.
Yeah, she did.
Good. Well, if people want to learn more about you and the book and Jo and things that you have going on, where should they go to find you?
Well, they can go to joanfernandezauthor.com. That is my website. And on my website, I've got info on Jo and, of course, the book and the writing of the book. But also, there is a subscription button if you'd like to check out I write a weekly essay called Digging In with Joan Fernandez. And you can subscribe on the website for that. I'd love to be saying hello to you once a week through that.
Good. And if they want to purchase a copy of Saving Vincent, where can they go to buy it?
It is available really anywhere that books are sold. You can go to Simon and Schuster's site, and then all of those purchase buttons are right there in a single place. So go to Simon and Schuster and then search for Saving Vincent, and that will take you right there.
Excellent. Well, Joan, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with Saving Vincent. Congratulations on it and everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you for all you're doing for us authors and for readers, bringing our voices and our titles for people to consider. So appreciate you.
Oh, well, you're welcome. I'm happy to help. The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.